Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Nourished Child. I'm Jill Castle, your host, and I'm delighted to share my guest with you today. But before we get started, I want to share that this podcast episode is a collaboration between the Nourished Child and Beef It's What's for Dinner, a contractor to the Beef Checkoff. As a nutrition consultant to National Cattlemen's Beef Association on behalf of the Beef Checkoff, my role is to share the science and support for beef's role in a healthy diet. Today with me is Ty Beal. Ty Beal is a global nutrition and food system scientist dedicated to achieving healthy and sustainable diets for all. Through his research, he examines dietary patterns and their impacts on human health and the environment. As a research advisor at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN, he helps shape evidence-based programs and policies. Dr. Beal received his PhD from the University of California, Davis. Welcome to the show, Ty.
It's nice to be here.
It's great to have you here. We have met years ago at a conference together. You have done a lot of your research seems to have centered around global nutrition, and today we're going to talk more specifically about teenagers, adolescents. And I always feel like, as a pediatric dietitian, that's the segment of childhood that oftentimes gets overlooked, but you're bringing a lot of attention to it in your research, and it's something I'm very happy to see. But let's start by defining adolescence. How would you describe this life stage, and really what ages are we talking about?
Sure. So adolescence is typically defined by the age group 10 to 19 years of age. Although sometimes it extends to 24 years of age. So really depends on who's talking about it. I would say the category of youth is really sort of the older adolescent age group, about 15 to 24. Teenagers, of course, are around 13 to 19. So there's some gray areas, but in general, it's that 10 to 19 age range in which children are transitioning to adulthood. So really, just about everything changes during that time. There's rapid growth and development, and a lot of implications for nutrition during that period.
Yeah. So what are some of the things, you mentioned growth and development, some of the things that make this life stage unique and perhaps even challenging when it comes to nutrition and food choices?
Yeah. So nutritionally, in terms of growth, adolescents gain about 20% of their adult height. So that's between the age of 10 to 19 years of age, about 50% of adult weight, and up to 40% of bone mass. So it's a huge transition stage where there's physical growth. And along with that, there's the sexual maturity. So there's menstruation for girls, which really increases iron requirements. And the increase in bone mass and others increases, calcium requirements. So in general, adolescents have higher nutrient requirements during this period, especially girls.
Yeah.
And, brain development is happening, and that continues on till age 25. But there's a lot of things that sort of make it challenging with their sort of dietary choices. So there's peer influence. There's the food environment with fast food becoming more available to them. There's marketing that's coming from all angles. And of course, social media, which can have a lot of negative aspects in terms of body image and peer pressure.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is, like, there's this growth aspect, right? This physiological growth. Everything is growing, right? Bones, arms, legs, bodies are growing, their brains are growing, but there's also like the social emotional component, the psychological component that's happening too. And I know in the work that I have done with teenagers, there's always seems to be this push-pull between parents and their teens. Teenagers, younger teenagers seem to want to be just like their peers, but when they become older, they want to be unique and different. They're taking risks. They have a drive to be independent and separating from their parents. So there's a lot of, yes, physical stuff, but there's a lot of psychological stuff, I imagine, influences sort of the food choices that they make at this time of life.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it really depends on the stage that they're in. But I think the key challenge is that it's a transition. So it's always changing.
Mm-hmm.
So what may be true today is going to be different tomorrow. And that's just an evolving situation. But one of the key sort of influences of their development that influences dietary choice is really the sort of meaningfulness of sharing food with friends and that sort of social interaction and the social
Mm-hmm.
connection. So that's often kind of one of the key aspects that becomes important. Adolescents may not care about their health. You can't necessarily convince them to eat differently because, you're gonna have a better, heart health or prevent diabetes down the line. It's like, no, what's relevant to me now, and really tapping into those values like the social connection aspect can really be important.
Yeah, yeah. I know I've raised 4 of my own teens, and socializing around food was a big thing. Like they were, meeting for coffee, going out for dinner, going out somewhere for a snack after school. There was just always a strong social element to food and eating together. So it makes a lot of sense to me. When we talk, though, you mentioned that girls, start their periods during this time, and that's a piece of a stage of puberty or a part of puberty. Does puberty for males or for boys alter nutritional requirements at all during that time as well? Or is it mostly girls that we're focused on?
So in terms of nutrient requirements, they do change for boys as well.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the minerals can change, but the biggest change is really for women. There's a lot of hormonal changes, I'm sure, as you know, and there are relevant changes psychologically. But in terms of their nutritional requirements, the biggest change is really for girls. Really depends also on their lifestyle. So if they're into sports and physical growth in terms of trying to optimize performance or muscle mass, certainly that's all changing, and their bodies are maturing, and so they're for athletes they need quite high amounts of protein in terms of macronutrients.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, they need more nutrient dense diets during that stage because they have a lot of growth happening.
Yeah. It seems like I can imagine that parents who are listening right now can sort of think about their own teens and the push and pull that is almost always happening around getting teens to come and sit down for a meal, getting them to eat breakfast. Parents will hear that it's such an important stage of life nutritionally, but the reality of getting teens to actually participate and eat a nutrient-rich diet, or to take the time to sit down and not skip a meal, for example, can be a bit frustrating. So that sort of leads me to this idea of, what are teens eating today? And I know that you've done some research on this. What are they eating in your observation, in your research, and what are they not eating?
Yeah, so there is really a limited amount of data on what adolescents are eating globally, and so that's sort of an important just data gap to fill in general. But we have some data on youth from the Gallup World Poll, which is has been collected in 56 countries globally, and we see some positive aspects in terms of consuming some fruits and vegetables, legumes, nuts, and seeds. In general, the lower income countries, when we're thinking globally, have less access to diverse diets. So their diets are really over-dependent on starchy staple foods like rice or wheat or corn. there's really a pretty high consumption of certain foods that can increase risk for NCDs when consumed in excess. So things like soft drinks, sugary, sweet foods, processed meat. So when we look at indicators of diet quality, it's not too far different from the data we have in terms of the total population. But I think what we're doing now is we're trying to explore that difference statistically, looking at the new data that's just coming in. Mm-hmm. So in the US, we see much higher intake of ultra processed foods, so highly processed foods. That is generally higher in the adolescent population in the US than the adult population. So it's high for all, but it's particularly high for adolescents in the US. One of the other things when you're looking globally is that the animal source food intake can be quite low in many countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. Mm-hmm. And that's not typically not from preference, but it's from lack of access or affordability. And so
can you dive into that just a little bit more, Ty, in terms of, lack of access? What does that mean? Because when I think of lack of access in the US, it might be socioeconomic, right? But is it different or is it the same globally when you're talking about access to animal-based foods?
Yeah, there's a lot of access issues. So affordability, so the economic aspect is really huge. And that's one of the key barriers. It's even a bigger issue in lower income countries, certainly than in the US, while even food insecurity does exist in the US. But we also have issues of access in terms of availability in markets, cold storage. So in rural communities, the ability to have refrigeration is limited, and you see other barriers to consumption, just all sorts of technological barriers. And what's sort of key is that these foods are desirable. So animal source foods are sort of what people want to eat more of. Mm-hmm. When they can't afford them and they can't access them. There's even, besides the sort of the taste, the nutritional quality, there's also an aspirational quality of sort of this food is, it sort of makes you feel good, and it makes you sort of a status to be able to consume those foods.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And sub-Saharan countries, are you referring to Africa? That country, or because
yeah.
I have heard, something along the lines of even just raising cattle there, for example, raising animals for beef is difficult because of water and containing them, the heat there. I don't know if you know much about that, but I remember hearing a little bit about that, and it was interesting to me.
Yeah, so I'm referring to, in sub-Saharan Africa really is most of Africa that's below the Sahara Desert. So it's Eastern and Southern Africa and Central Africa and Western Africa. And it's a combination of lower income and middle income countries. Mm-hmm. In terms of livestock is sort of an important component of livelihoods in many of these contexts. And so women who often don't have access to finance are able to control resources. Sometimes their only or one of their main sources of sort of impact or control is or assets is livestock. So they are a key aspect of livelihoods. But in terms of productivity, and there's lower productivity than in higher income countries because of lack of access to breeding, to veterinary services, to improved feed that is available. And then the climate challenges are really important. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities in terms of natural disasters or increased heat and climate change that really can make it challenging to have livestock. But it's also the case for crops. So in many of these areas, they're not necessarily the land is not able to be cultivated for crops. And so livestock are really the only way to use that land for food production.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. So so globally you're seeing teenagers eat more of the starchy grains, fruits, vegetables, contrasting that with US teens who are consuming more ultra processed foods, prepared foods, perhaps. What do you see when you look at those two populations in terms of global versus US based tendencies, in terms of what is influencing a teenager's food choices?
That's quite.
Yeah.
There's a big difference depending on the context, of course. So when you're in what's typically called a modern food environment or a higher income country like the US, desirability really is a key sort of aspect that drives choice. So like desirability is what's the interest in that food? How does it, what's the appeal? What's the taste? What's the flavor? What's the, and sort of appeal? And in terms of availability, that's, there are some challenges with food insecurity, but it's a much lower importance. When you're in more traditional type food environments where there's not these access to markets and there's not as much options, it's really generally the dominant motivator is the availability and affordability of foods. And so there's a desire to consume more diverse diets, more animal source foods, but they're not available. That's the global sort of lower income countries.
Yeah, the factors influencing teens' food choices. In the US, what do you see influencing teen food choices?
Yeah, so there's a lot of influence from marketing of food. So marketing occurs on all sorts of media, but social media as well. So there's a lot of in general, this is also applicable globally, but especially in the US and high income countries, there's influence of sort of role models. So when you see food commercials with sort of sports stars or athletes, that's a big factor. And then that is sort of like I mentioned earlier, it sort of applies everywhere. This social interaction that really influences choices, but it really depends on what foods are available during those social interactions. So what is the when you think about a high school, what sort of food is available? And it's oftentimes fast food that's available. And the things that adolescents will like to do is generally not in these like sort of traditional home cooked meal, come together as a family and have this meal together, but more so eating out.
So obviously, eating out, choosing, more processed or affordable foods that might be of lower nutrient density, that's going to have some impact on their eating behaviors and their health. What sort of impacts are you seeing, particularly in the U.S. teenager? Because a lot of the parents listening to this will have, their point of reference is the United States, but what are you seeing in the US in terms of these food choices on teen health?
Yeah, so the burden of sort of the health burden from these really high intake of ultra processed foods generally is associated with the chronic diseases. So we see a lot more diabetes and prediabetes happening in children and adolescents. And this has been increasing over the last few decades. Heart disease, so different cardiovascular disease that's beginning, and then obesity in general. So excess intake just from, in general, the food environment that these foods are appealing. They're hard, they're addicting, they can cause overconsumption. And at the same time, there's the social media influence, especially on girls, having to sort of look a certain way that often will cause eating disorders, where it can be higher in the US than in lower income contexts. And so those disorders have the opposite effect, right? Where there's often an underconsumption and a sort of desire to be thin. And so for those groups, it's sort of this underconsumption, underweight issue. For both of those groups, there's a lack of nutrient density. So they're not getting essential nutrient needs met. And I think one of the surprising things to people to hear in the US is that for women, children, and adolescents even, diets are inadequate in nutrients, and those are resulting in micronutrient deficiencies. So we see pretty high prevalence of, for example, iron deficiency in the US among adolescent girls, around 20%. So 1 in 5 having a deficiency in iron. Other micronutrients as well, like zinc, are also prevalent.
Kids change a lot. Their nutrition needs, eating habits, and food preferences do too. So much so, it can be hard to keep up. The Nourished Child, a website designed for parents who want more nutrition education, helps parents like you get crystal clear on raising good eaters. We've cracked the code on nourishing the whole child, whether you're raising a baby, a teen, or a child with health concerns. Our nutrition school and parent education programs help you get the inside scoop on food and nutrients, positive food parenting, and building self-motivated, autonomous kids who are good eaters. Visit thenourishedchild.com today. That will be interesting for listeners to hear, because iron deficiency, it still is surprising to me. It's one of the leading nutrient deficiencies in the US at younger ages too. But to hear that it is a 1 in 5 teens are experiencing a deficit of iron and potentially zinc, that's pretty important. What is that? What are sort of the consequences of that deficiency on teen health?
Yeah, so iron deficiency is one of the leading causes of anemia. So anemia can cause all sorts of things like lack of energy, reduced performance. In general, these deficiencies like iron and others can hinder school performance and actually hinder development. So the functions needed for brain development are getting constrained. And it's what I think is surprising is that this is definitely a bigger issue in lower income countries, but it's actually quite prevalent even in the US. And so something that needs attention.
And this is coming from making these everyday food choices. And I know, because I've worked with kids and I've had my own teens, when you choose to skip breakfast, you're at a bit of a deficit. If you're trying to meet all your nutritional requirements throughout the day and you're down a meal, that can be a fairly nutritious meal, depending on what you're choosing. But these singular food choices, or these everyday eating patterns that teens in the US are experiencing, are, it sounds like, leading to a significant 1 in 5 is significant, 20% is significant. If a parent is out there wondering, oh my gosh, I'm not sure my teenager is getting enough iron, are there, signs or symptoms or things to watch out for? I know you mentioned fatigue. I know there's loss of concentration sometimes with an iron deficit. Other things, you did mention at the top of the show that brain development is still happening in up to 25, I believe you said, which I know iron is part of that. I interviewed Dr. Michael Georgieff, and we talked about iron and brain development in very young children on this podcast. So I know that iron is integral to that. Are we seeing that sort of still play out, or is there much research in that area of the impact of a 1 in 5 teens not getting enough iron on their, brain maturation, I guess, into their 20s?
Yeah, I think we really need more data to understand all of the consequences. It's very clear when we in my field, when we look at the indicators that are telling you if somebody has iron deficiency or zinc deficiency or folate deficiency, those have been established because of the associated health consequences. Mm-hmm. It's really not clear for all of these. They don't have to be specific symptoms. So it's not just easy. It wouldn't be easy for a parent to just, say, oh, you're probably deficient, unless they're sort of the clear, like iron deficiency, anemia. is going on. But they can be having a big impact, especially when you think about the multiple insults of not getting enough sleep, having multiple nutrient deficiencies, maybe having also some chronic disease risk factors as well. I think the most important thing would be to test. So for women, I think especially for adolescent girls, once they start menstruation, it would be really important to check iron status. And that's a pretty simple test that can be ordered through the doctor. And I think it's really worthwhile. And you would be surprised. I mean, even for women of reproductive age and even older women, it's very common. I have a colleague who eats a very nutrient dense diet, who's written papers with me on the importance of iron, and then she got tested and was iron deficient, right? And so it's not easy. Yeah. It's not easy to meet iron needs, especially for women. And so I think testing is really, if you can afford it, having a test from the doctor is really worthwhile.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we talked a little bit about, what motivates adolescents to choose the foods that they choose. Social, we talked about that. What about taste, flavor? Is that still a driver? I remember an old study that pointed out that, taste and appearance were the two main drivers for younger children in terms of the foods that they chose. What is it that drives an adolescent or sways them to choose one food over another?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I don't know the answer directly. It really varies on the context. We know the different types of things that influence their choice. So we know that taste, convenience, social appeal, and other factors influence that. But it's if I was to ask me in the US, I'm not sure, because I haven't actually looked. I'm not sure what the data says or if there is data on that. But certainly there's this aspect of when we are looking at programs of how do you change diets, it's very hard to change behaviors. But the key way that you would need to do it is to tap into motivators that the population cares about. So if it's adolescents, what do they care about? And one of the ways to do that is by asking them. So when you do that in certain countries, the answer may vary depending on the context and the culture. But including adolescents in this process of, well, how are we going to make a difference and change diets? We'll ask adolescents what would motivate them to eat differently. And I think we can take, if we use that, we can take the context specific answers to really develop programs or policies that are going to help change that. And I think one of the things that we learn working globally is that you really need to include adolescents in the discussion, in the design of policies and programs. There are adolescent leaders who can help who can be engaged in that process. And so that's really been, I think, insightful for us.
When you, can you recollect, asking teens and some of the responses that perhaps they gave you when you asked them about what is important to them? Because that is the question when it comes to teenagers. What motivates them? It's a big question for everybody who works with them.
Yeah. I was a part of a paper that some of the other colleagues asked those questions in different countries, and so there are some example questions in the UK. There was a response. I'm looking at a figure here that has a couple of these examples, and it says all your friends are having like another chocolate bar or packet of crisps all the time. You're going to want to like buy a chocolate bar. So peer influence, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of the classic peer influence in the UK. That was in urban UK. There's two more examples here. There's a boy in urban Bangladesh. Families don't get to buy them always. Even if they buy, I may feel like not eating these foods. We can't buy mango jackfruit all the time. So I think that's dealing with the sort of
scarcity.
Access.
Yeah.
We don't, it's not really a choice. It's not up to us, right? You hear this idea of food choice. Food choice only goes so far, right? If you don't have access to it, you can't can't afford
Right.
it, you don't have a choice.
Right.
And the last one here, that's sort of an example. In rural India, this is a girl. We don't get root vegetables or fruits that often, only once a month. So that was in a traditional type food environment where access is very limited. So I mean,
Yeah.
once a month, that's pretty extreme.
And I would say, in my experience working with teens, how to motivate them, it is tricky. Every teen is different. I mean, what motivates me? Every human being is different. What motivates me is not what is going to motivate you, Ty, right? We all have our different priorities. And I think with teenagers, a big thing is their drive to be independent and autonomous, and asking them really taps into getting your claws into their desire to be leading the charge, setting the pace, telling you what's important to them. So I think that's really clever. What advice would you say to a mom or a dad or a caretaker out there in charge of a teenager who is wanting to help them make better food choices, particularly if they have a nutrient deficit or an actual, deficiency like iron deficiency anemia?
Yeah, I think it's probably important to act on all the different levels that we can. So in a society-wide way, thinking about policies trying to influence, so in lower income countries, make diverse, healthy foods more affordable and accessible. So investing in that.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of parents, this is sort of my opinion, but I would think trying to do family meals could be one way, especially
Mm-hmm.
if there's interest, or you can get interest in sort of having adolescents help cook or take ownership in making some of the meal. You could always invite friends over. You could always have it sort of be an open door where their friends are welcome to come. I know I really enjoyed sort of going to family dinner at friends' houses.
Mm-hmm.
Introduce new and a variety of foods. So keeping things different and this may be a lot of work, but trying new recipes, introducing new foods, maybe things that are, you can, like you said, these sort of tapping into the autonomy, let some of the adolescents choose what they eat, choose what to buy, maybe buy some sort of unique cultural food or something. And then educating. I think one of the things, education is good for education's sake. It doesn't always change behaviors, but what I've noticed, I think this is anecdotal, but it's from my own experience. If I'm constantly learning or being reminded about things, about nutrition, about health, about well-being, I'm much more likely to act on them because it's sort of like a regular stream. So I think just if you could make it sort of part of everyday conversation, I think there shouldn't be any sort of shaming. There shouldn't be any sort of like eat so that you look a certain way. It should be, here's the nutritional value of food. This is why it's important to eat. And then I think, so this is especially relevant in higher income countries, but like if you were to change, if you're able to change policies, really like limiting junk food marketing to adolescents, you can, in some countries, I've actually seen limits to the types of foods and vendors that are around schools.
Mm-hmm.
So actually making unhealthy food less available, and but not just less available, but making healthy foods available, and offering school meals that have healthy foods, etc.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the key thing really is when you're trying to change behavior, it's really harnessing the adolescent values, which some of the key ones are social time with friends, to help change their dietary choices.
Yeah. And for parents out there who are listening, if we really sort of tap into the whole, risk for iron deficiency, for example, or zinc deficiency, as you mentioned, there are foods that are rich in those nutrients that are, good sources of those nutrients, like beef, like other meats, like poultry, for example. Or, but there are a lot of teens that want to try and or are invested in following a vegetarian diet. Do you have any sort of data or research around, how or how that might increase their risk for iron deficiency or anything like that?
Yeah, I think this push for plant-based, vegan, vegetarianism in the US is sort of a double-edged sword.
Mm-hmm.
If it's increasing consumption of, minimally processed fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and seeds, that can actually be a good thing because those are underconsumed.
Mm-hmm.
But what often happens is that it actually there's a sort of a shift to a less healthy alternative. So it's a highly processed type food. It's refined, and so it not only does it not contain the essential nutrients that, say, beef or other meat may have, it also might increase, chronic disease risk. So in general, there is a point at which you consume, most people, it's harder to meet your nutrient requirements the lower you go in animal source foods. And so
Mm-hmm.
the risk increases for iron, zinc, and vitamin B12 deficiency. And it becomes very challenging. It's not impossible, but meeting, for example, iron and zinc needs with very low intake of animal source foods is just challenging. So really, I think the messaging of the sort of you need to go plant-based or vegan or vegetarian is quite misplaced. I think it should be you need to have a healthy diet, which when you look at the dietary challenges in the US, it's not really that adolescents are consuming too much animal source foods. I would say they're consuming too much unhealthy foods in terms of the highly processed foods.
Mm-hmm.
And animal source food consumption is probably, at least the minimally processed form, is probably only a minor contribution to any chronic disease risk. And the benefits on the nutrient adequacy side are really important.
Yeah, it's you've really shed some light on some of the more current data around iron status, zinc status in that teenager population. In your opinion, as you look down the road for more scientific research in the area of adolescent nutrition, what do you see as a need or as a gap that needs to be filled in terms of what we need to know more about related to adolescents and their nutritional status?
Yeah, I think it'd be really insightful to learn more about how these nutrient deficiencies are affecting health, school performance, cognitive performance, well-being in general.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's sort of a research, I guess, the typical research question. There's also this, it's more of a either program implementation or policy research question of how do we actually change diets. I think that's probably the most important, because if you were to take the latest advice on dietary recommendations and just provide the food and force an adolescent to eat a healthy diet, I think we know enough to know that you could provide a healthy diet. But how do you make this in a sort of more systematic way? How do you introduce changes that are lasting? How do you change behavior? That's a really hard question to answer when you look at it in the real world setting, because of the numerous factors that influence food choice.
Yeah. Yeah. What programs do you see are needed for adolescents related to nutrition? Are there policies, programming that could improve nutrition for adolescents that, if you had to create your wish list or create the ideal program, what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, there are things that I would do if I had control. I would limit marketing of sort of the known sort of junk foods. I would sort of try to improve school meals so that they're really providing a diversity of minimally processed foods that are contributing to health. And I mean, otherwise, if I was designing programs, I would ask adolescents in the US, for example, I would ask them to participate in that so that it would be tailored, but really use them as champions of maybe try to create a social movement. Mm-hmm. Having adolescents lead that. We did that in Bangladesh. Mm-hmm. There was I remember being in the room in Dhaka with a bunch of adolescents from Bangladesh, and we were brainstorming ideas. And one of the sort of key idea that came through was this, what ended up being called a pocket money pledge. And that was, relevant to the Bangladesh context, but they had most adolescents had some pocket money to buy a snack. They made a public, like a sort of social campaign to say, we're going to pledge to purchase a healthy option with our food. And they had people sign up to sort of create a social movement. There are over 1 million adolescents that have signed up to that.
Wow.
And I think that shows you the power of working with adolescents, because you're asking them what they want to see change. How would that change come about? And using them as agents of change. So in the US, I would probably try to do something similar, where the actual solution may be, we don't really know at this point, right? But it would be working with them to produce that, to come up with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think partnership with adolescents is key. Anyway, if you're a parent or you're creating programs or you're a teacher, they have so much insight into what motivates them. And they really do see the world in a way that can be super helpful to us who have not been teenagers for decades in terms of helping them work towards, better nutrition, better eating patterns, and sort of living that healthy lifestyle that we all want them to. If you, as we wrap this interview up, if you think about what you would want parents out there to know about adolescent nutrition based on the research that you've done, both globally and here in the US, what is it that is most important for parents to know about their teens' nutrition?
Yeah, so I think it's just really important to engage with them in discussions about health and I guess what they desire and what they're interested in. But if I was to say what's the biggest impact, it would really be trying to transition away from the ultra processed foods to more of a sort of minimally processed diet. So what that would look like may vary depending on the household, but trying to do more cooking together, inviting families over, trying to have more community type eating, because we know, not just adolescents, of course, all of us humans like social connection, but in particular, adolescents view eating as sort of a time to engage with friends. And so I would try to create opportunities to have that happen in healthy food environments. And of course, diet and nutrition is just one aspect of health for adolescents. So I wouldn't give it an outsized emphasis, but it is a key component that really has knock-on effects for many other areas of life. And I think getting, as children are growing into adolescence and then adults, it's a kind of an opportunity a sort of a last opportunity to influence their dietary habits that will last them a lifetime. And so trying to establish that in the adolescent period, I think through really intentional interactions and social systems, whether it's, family dinners or group meals where you have friends come over, I think that's a really key way to do that.
Yeah, that's great. That's great advice. Thank you so much for joining me today for this discussion. I'll have the show notes on thenourished.child.com, and I will include your research paper that I used as a basis for this interview. And for listeners out there, be sure to check out the show notes on thenourished.child.com. Visit Beef It's What for Dinner. It's What's for Dinner.com for more information, including resources and recipes for adolescent nutrition. Ty, thank you so much. It's great to see you again. Maybe our paths will cross in real time again one of these days.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me, Jill. It was great to be here.
You bet.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.